In 1968, the United States told its people that victory in Vietnam was finally within reach. The enemy, they said, was exhausted, broken, nearly defeated, and then almost overnight, everything collapsed. Gunfire echoed through major cities. Explosions lit up the streets of Saigon, and for the first time ever, the U.S. Embassy itself came under attack. So here's the question that still haunts history. How did a so-called losing army shock the most powerful nation on Earth?
The historical mystery that no one expected by the end of 1967. The story Americans were hearing felt reassuring. Government briefings were confident. Military leaders spoke with certainty. The message was clear. The war in Vietnam was turning in America's favor. U.S. officials claimed the enemy was weakened. They said North Vietnamese forces were running out of manpower, supplies, and morale. Some even suggested the war could soon be wrapped up, and on paper, it all made sense. At that point, the United States had more than 500,000 troops deployed in Vietnam. It controlled the skies with overwhelming air power. It had cutting-edge weapons, advanced intelligence systems, and the strongest military logistics network in the world. From a purely military perspective, this was a superpower fighting a much smaller, poorer nation, so Americans trusted the numbers. They trusted the maps. They trusted the speeches. But here's where the mystery begins. If the enemy was really on the verge of collapse, why did the war suddenly feel like it was slipping away? Because in January of 1968, something happened that shattered the entire narrative. Across South Vietnam, enemy forces launched one of the largest, most coordinated attacks in modern military history. Not just against remote bases or jungle outposts, but against cities, against government centers, against symbols of American power. This wasn't a desperate last stand. It wasn't a small uprising. It was precise, timed, and devastatingly bold. So pause for a moment and think. About that, how could a force described as near-collapse plan and execute an operation of this scale? How did thousands of fighters move undetected, stockpile weapons, and strike almost simultaneously across an entire country without the world's most advanced intelligence system stopping them? That question alone should make us uneasy, because it suggests that something was deeply misunderstood. Either American leaders were wrong about the enemy's strength, or they misunderstood the very nature of the war they were fighting. And this is where the Tet Offensive becomes more than just a military event. It becomes a lesson about perception, confidence, and the danger of believing your own story too completely. You see, wars are not fought only with bullets and bombs. They are fought with expectations, with morale, with belief. By late 1967, the United States believed it was winning, and that belief shaped every decision that followed. But history has a way of punishing certainty. The Tet Offensive didn't just attack cities. It attacked assumptions. It exposed the gap between what Americans were told and what was actually happening on the ground. And once that gap became visible, once it appeared on television screens, in living rooms across the country, nothing would ever feel the same again. So, the real mystery isn't just how the attack happened. The deeper question is this: was the Tet Offensive a military defeat for Vietnam, or was it the moment the United States began to lose the war without realizing it? And to understand that, we have to look beyond the battlefield and into the minds of those watching the war unfold in real time. The moment of false security,
Saigon,
January 1968. On the surface, Vietnam appeared unusually calm. For American soldiers and commanders, this moment felt familiar, almost routine. The Tet holiday, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, was approaching. It was the most important celebration of the year, a time centered on family, tradition, and renewal. In previous years, Tet often meant something else as well. Temporary ceasefires, fighting usually slowed, gunfire faded, soldiers on both sides took a breath. Many Vietnamese fighters traditionally returned home during Tet. Some visited family, others simply stepped away from the battlefield, even if only briefly. American forces had seen this pattern before, and over time, it shaped expectations. So by January 1968, a quiet assumption settled in: nothing will happen during Tet, not because American commanders were careless, but because history had trained them to expect calm. When war follows patterns long enough, those patterns start to feel permanent. But war has a habit of punishing assumptions. Because while Americans saw a holiday, Vietnamese planners saw something else entirely. Behind the scenes, something extraordinary was unfolding. While cities prepared for celebration, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were already moving. Weapons were being smuggled in piece by piece. Fighters slipped into urban areas not in uniform but dressed as civilians. They blended into markets, neighborhoods, and villages. Some carried supplies in baskets. Some hid weapons under food shipments. Others used networks that had existed quietly for years. And beneath the ground, the movement continued. Hidden and nearly invisible connected safe houses, storage points, and escape routes. These underground systems allowed fighters to move where American surveillance could not see, hear, or track them. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't desperation. It was coordination. Perfect timing mattered. And Tet provided exactly that. Fireworks, crowds, music, distraction. The very things that signaled peace to American forces helped mask the final preparations for war. Think about that for a moment. An entire military operation, one of the largest in modern history, was unfolding in plain sight. Not in jungles or remote hills, but inside cities filled with civilians. And the closer Tet came, the safer it all seemed. From the American perspective, this quiet felt reassuring. From the Vietnamese perspective, it was camouflage. This contrast is critical to understand. What the United States interpreted as restraint, Vietnam interpreted as opportunity. And this difference in perception may have been the most decisive weapon of all. Because while American commanders relaxed their guard, believing tradition would hold, Vietnamese leaders made a bold calculation. Surprise would outweigh firepower. They understood something deeply human about war, that the most dangerous moment is not when your enemy is alert, but when they feel safe. By the time the holiday arrived, the pieces were already in place. Fighters were positioned, targets were selected, routes were planned down to the minute. All that remained was the signal, and when it came, it didn't matter how many troops the US had, or how advanced its weapons were. Because shock doesn't ask for permission, it simply arrives. And when the Tet Offensive finally erupted, it would feel less like an attack and more like the sudden collapse of an illusion. An illusion built on habit, on confidence, on the belief that the enemy would behave the way they always had before. History would soon prove how dangerous that belief can be. Because the most devastating attacks don't always come when you're weakest. Sometimes they come when you think you're safe.
Before we go any further, let me be clear about what this story is in What Did I Ascend single quotes. This is not just a story about battles, troop movements, or military strategy. Those details matter, but they don't explain why the Tet Offensive still echoes through history more than half a century later. Because here's the paradox that makes Tet so unsettling. Vietnam lost the battles. The United States won most of the firefights. And yet, the war itself was never the same again. So in this video, we're going to unpack how that happened. We're going to look at how the Tet Offensive was planned, not as a last act of desperation, but as a calculated gamble, a decision made with full awareness of the risks. And we'll explore why Vietnamese leaders believed surprise, timing, and psychology could succeed where raw firepower could not. We'll also examine why the offensive shocked the U.S. military. Even though American forces ultimately pushed the attackers back, how commanders who believed they had control suddenly found themselves reacting instead of leading, and what that revealed about the limits of intelligence, technology, and assumptions. But perhaps more importantly, we'll explore why Tet shocked the American public. Because this was one of the first wars truly fought on television. Images didn't arrive months later in history books. They appeared almost immediately in living rooms across the country. And those images told a very different story than the one Americans had been hearing. Ask yourself this: what happens when a government says victory is near, but the screen in front of you shows cities under attack? What happens when trust collides with reality? That collision is at the heart of Tet. And finally, we're going to uncover the hidden reason the Tet Offensive changed the war. Even though Vietnam paid an enormous military price for it, this is the part of the story that often gets oversimplified. Tet was not a military win for Vietnam in the traditional sense. Casualties were massive. Entire units were destroyed. By conventional standards, it should have been a failure. But wars are not decided by statistics alone. They are decided by morale, by belief, by the question every society eventually asks: is this war still worth it? Tet forced that question into the open. For the first time, many Americans began to doubt not just the progress of the war but the way it had been explained to them. And once doubt takes root, even the strongest military position can begin to erode. This is why Tet remains one of the most studied moments in modern history, because it shows us something deeply uncomfortable. That power does not always belong to the side with the most weapons. Sometimes it belongs to the side that understands perception better. As we move forward in this story, keep this paradox in mind. How could an offensive that failed on the battlefield succeed in reshaping an entire war? How could a moment of apparent defeat become a strategic turning point? By the end of this video, you won't just understand what happened during the Tet Offensive, you'll understand why it changed the way wars are fought, explained, and remembered. Because Tet wasn't just an attack, it was a message. And once that message was delivered, there was no going back. January 30th, 1968, as night fell across Vietnam. Cities prepared to welcome the Lunar New Year. Families gathered. Streets filled with lights. Firecrackers echoed through the air. And then almost at the same moment, everything exploded. Across South Vietnam, more than 100 cities and towns were attacked simultaneously. Not slowly, not one by one, but all at once. This wasn't a border clash. This wasn't jungle warfare. This was urban combatant, a scale no one expected. In Saigon, fighting erupted in the heart of the capital. In Huc, one of Vietnam's most historic cities, enemy forces surged through the streets and raised their flags. U.S. and South Vietnamese military bases came under attack. Police stations, radio stations, and government buildings were targeted. And then came the image that stunned the world. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon, symbol of American power, was reached, even though the attackers were eventually killed or captured. The damage was already done. The fact that the embassy itself could be struck shattered the illusion of control. Because symbols matter in war. And that symbol said, no place is truly safe. Behind these attacks was a massive force, roughly 84,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. They struck not from remote areas, but from inside cities. They moved through streets where civilians lived, where journalists filmed, and where cameras captured everything. For American viewers back home, this was shocking. This didn't look like a war that was being won. One of the fiercest battles unfolded in Huc. Enemy forces captured much of the city and held it for nearly a month. Fighting there was brutal, slow, and devastating. Block by block, house by house, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops fought to retake the city. By the time it was over, Huc was heavily damaged. Thousands were dead. And the cost on all sides was enormous. Now, here's the part that often gets lost. From a purely military perspective, the United States and South Vietnam eventually repelled the attacks. Most of the cities were retaken. Enemy units suffered catastrophic losses. Entire Viet Cong formations were destroyed. Vietnam paid a terrible price. So if that's true, if the U.S. won the battles, why did this moment feel like defeat? Because war is not just about territory, it's about expectations. Americans had been told the enemy was weakened, that victory was near, that progress was steady and measurable. But Tet told a different story. It showed an enemy capable of striking everywhere at once, an enemy willing to absorb massive losses to make a point, an enemy that understood the power of surprise and the power of images. For the first time, many Americans didn't hear about the war through official statements. They saw it, they saw firefights in cities. They saw smoke rising behind embassy walls. They saw chaos where they were promised stability, and once those images reached living rooms across the United States, the war changed forever. Because no briefing could erase what people had already seen. Tet didn't defeat the U.S. military on the battlefield. It defeated the story Americans had been told about the war. That contradiction, the gap between military success and psychological shock, is what made Tet so powerful. Left people asking a dangerous question. If we're winning, why does this look like we're losing? And that question would echo long after the gunfire stopped. Because from that moment on, the war in Vietnam was no longer just being fought overseas. It was being fought in the minds of the American public. For the first time in American history, a war didn't wait for history books to be written. It came straight into people's homes. Night after night, families sat down in their living rooms, turned on the television, and watched Vietnam unfold in real time. They didn't see lines on a map. They didn't hear carefully chosen words from a podium. They saw urban fire. They saw cities burning. They saw gunfire echoing through streets that looked nothing like distant battlefields. And then they saw something they were never supposed to see. U.S. Embassy under attack. That single image did more than any battlefield loss ever could, because it didn't just show challenged belief. Up until that moment, Americans had been told a clear story. Progress was being made. The enemy was on the defensive. Victory was approaching. But television told a different story. One filled with smoke, with confusion, with uncertainty. And suddenly, two realities existed at the same time. The government said, "We're winning." Television answered, "This is chaos." That contradiction was impossible to ignore. Tet didn't defeat the U.S. Army. It defeated the narrative. And once belief breaks, everything changes. People began asking questions they hadn't asked before. If the war was under control, why were cities under attack? If victory was near, why did this look like the beginning of something worse? For many Americans, Tet was the moment trust cracked. Not because leaders were lying outright, but because the story no longer matched the reality on the screen. And when trust in leadership weakens, public support doesn't just fade, it collapses. Across the United States, reactions came fast. College campuses erupted in protest. City streets filled with demonstrators. Families argued at dinner tables. Veterans returned home to a country divided over what the war even meant. This wasn't just opposition to a war, it was a crisis of confidence. People began to question not only Vietnam but the decisions, assumptions, and promises that had led them there. Even inside Washington, the impact was immediate. President Lyndon B. Johnson, once confident and forceful, now faced a nation deeply unsure of its direction. Poll numbers fell, support fractured. And then came a moment that stunned the country. In March of 19, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election, a sitting president, stepping aside in the middle of a war. That decision didn't happen in a vacuum. Tet had exposed the political cost of continuing a war the public no longer believed in. And soon after, the administration began scaling back the conflict. signaling a shift away from escalation. This is why Tet matters so much. Not because of how many battles were won or lost, but because it revealed a new truth about modern warfare. Wars are no longer decided only on distant battlefields. They are decided in living rooms, on television screens. In public opinion, Tet showed that even overwhelming military power can be undone when belief disappears. And once that belief is gone, no amount of victory on paper can bring it back. This was the moment the Vietnam War crossed a line. From a military conflict overseas to a political and psychological struggle at home. And from that point forward, the question was no longer just can we win. It became something far more dangerous. Do we still believe in what we're being told? That question would linger for years, and it would shape not just the end of the Vietnam War but the way Americans viewed every war that followed. Here is the part of the story that feels uncomfortable, because once the smoke cleared, once the gunfire faded, and once the cities were retaken, the numbers told a very different story than the emotions did. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was devastating for Vietnam. Tens of thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed. Entire units were wiped out. The Viet Cong, in particular, would never fully recover as a fighting force in the same way again, by traditional military standards. This should have been a clear American victory. The attacks were repelled. The cities were reclaimed. The enemy paid a massive price. And yet, something didn't add up. Because despite winning the battles, the United States began losing something far more important: belief. This is the paradox of Tet. On the battlefield, Vietnam lost, but in the minds of the American people, the United States began to lose the war. Not because Americans suddenly sympathized with the enemy, but because they no longer trusted the story. They had been told. Tet exposed a painful contradiction. The enemy could launch attacks of this scale. If cities and symbols of power could be struck, then the promise that victory was just around the corner no longer felt believable. And once belief collapses, power weakens. This is where Tet becomes more than a military event. It becomes a lesson in psychology, because wars are not decided only by who wins more battles. They are decided by who can endure longer, by who maintains confidence, by who convinces their society that the cost is still worth paying. Vietnam understood this. They didn't need to defeat the U.S. Army in one decisive moment. That was never realistic. What they needed was something far more achievable. They needed to prove that the war could not be won the way Americans had been promised, that no amount of firepower could guarantee control, that no number of troops could ensure certainty, that the war would remain unpredictable, costly, and endless. Tet delivered that message with brutal clarity. That it said, we are still here, and we can still strike. And for the American public, that was enough. This is why Tet is often described as a psychological earthquake. It didn't destroy armies. It destroyed assumptions, that it shattered the idea that progress was linear. That victory followed numbers. That confidence alone could shape reality. From that moment on, the war was no longer just about defeating an enemy overseas. It became about convincing people at home that the fight still made sense. And that was a battle that the United States would struggle to win. Here's the hardest truth of all. Vietnam didn't need to win the war in 1968. They only needed to prove that the United States could not win it the way it expected to. And once that proof was delivered, once doubt took hold, the outcome of the war, slowly but inevitably, changed. This is why Tet remains one of the most studied moments in modern history. Because it shows us something deeply unsettling about power, that even the strongest nations can be undone, not by defeat, but by disbelief. That perception can outweigh victory. That confidence, once lost, is almost impossible to recover, and that sometimes the most decisive blows in war are not delivered on the battlefield, but inside the human mind. This is the true legacy of the Tet Offensive, a moment where losing became winning, where defeat became strategy, and where a single shock reshaped the course of an entire war. When the dust finally settled after the Tet Offensive, the battlefield told one story. But history tells another. Because if there is one dangerous truth Tet forces us to confront, it's this: wars are not won by firepower alone. The United States had more troops, more weapons, more technology, more control of the skies, and yet, none of that could protect it from what Tet ultimately destroyed. Belief. The belief that progress was steady. The belief that victory followed numbers. The belief that this war could be managed, measured, and explained in neat terms. Tet shattered those assumptions. It showed that perception can outweigh reality, that what people believe is happening can matter more than what is actually happening on the ground. From a military standpoint, the United States did not lose Tet. The attacks were repelled. Cities were retaken. The enemy suffered enormous losses. But psychologically, something irreversible had occurred. Morale began to erode, not just among soldiers, but among the people watching from home, among families who trusted official statements, among citizens who wanted to believe that sacrifices had a clear purpose and a clear end. And when morale weakens, even the strongest armies begin to struggle. Tet revealed another uncomfortable truth, that wars are ultimately fought in the human mind. No amount of firepower can force belief. No victory can matter if it no longer feels meaningful. No success can hold if the cost seems endless. This is why history remembers Tet not as a single battle but as a turning point. It marked the moment when many Americans stopped asking how the war would be won and started asking whether it should be. And that shift, quiet, gradual, but unstoppable, reshaped everything that followed. Here's the paradox that makes Tet so haunting. Sometimes, the side that loses the battle wins the war. Vietnam did not defeat the U.S. Army in 1968, but it succeeded in proving something far more powerful, that the war could not be won the way America expected. That certainty was an illusion, that endurance and perception could matter more than dominance. Once that realization took hold, the trajectory of the war slowly but inevitably changed. And this lesson didn't end with Vietnam. Tet changed how wars are fought, reported, and remembered. It taught governments that public trust is as critical as military strength. It taught societies that transparency matters. And it taught the world that modern warfare does not end when the fighting stops, it ends when belief runs out. So as we look back on the Tet Offensive, the final question remains, was Tet a failure? Or was it the most successful loss in modern military history? That question has no simple answer. And maybe that's the point, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we learn when certainty collapses in, how those lessons shape the future.